So this is going to be a spoiler-free review of Black Panther Wakanda Forever, the much-anticipated sequel to the Marvel Studios phenomenon from 2018. As I just mentioned, the first Black Panther was an absolute phenomenon. What a film phenomenon is any movie that just takes the whole world by storm unexpectedly. In the past decade or so, we've had movie phenomenons like The Dark Knight, the first Frozen. This year it was Top Gun Maverick, and in 2018 it was Black Panther. The movie just had amazing cultural relevance, a killer soundtrack, and overall it was just a fantastic movie. You know, in terms of my own personal MCU favorites, it's in my top 4. But in terms of being the best, well, it has as good a case as any to be the best MCU film, and arguably is, with all the great stuff it has going for it. For those reasons and more, there was more than enough reason to be curious and excited for the sequel. However, as everyone knows, some of that curiosity was unfortunately due to the unfortunate passing of Mr. Black Panther himself, Chadwick Boseman, who died at age 42 in August of 2020 of colon cancer, well before production on this film began. Because of this, and after the obvious mourning period, and for such a great guy and a fantastic actor, everyone's attention after that naturally turned to how would this affect the sequel. Well, 2.5 years later, we have our answer to that with the release of Black Panther Wakanda Forever. In this movie, following the passing of King T'Challa, Wakanda finds itself in a recovery period while dealing with a new threat from a civilization that comes from the seas led by a ruler named Namor. Now, I'm not going to get into any obvious spoilers in this video, but I'll just say that now, when it comes to Boseman's passing, well, it's incorporated into the film, into the story, obviously, as many people already kind of guessed from the trailers. And you know what? It's handled as classy and profoundly as I believe they personally could have. Without spoiling the ins and outs of the scenes, there's no shenanigans when it comes to dancing around it, or gimmicks or methods used in previous films that had to incorporate an actor's passing into the story. It's profound and impactful scenes that definitely set the mood for this movie and appropriately pay tribute to the beloved actor's passing. Despite all that, the movie is not a 2.5-hour funeral and does have a decent amount of moments of levity and appropriate levels of humor that are around the same level as the first Black Panther. That first Black Panther does not go all out on the comedy that movies like Guardians of the Galaxy or Ant-Man does, but it still had its moments here and there, and so does this film, appropriately so. Otherwise, it would definitely feel way too heavy if you were watching a 2.5-hour funeral. Overall, I have no sort of complaints on how they handled the things here. It was a near impossible situation that Ryan Coogler was thrust into this film, and they did about as good a job as any. I'll get more into Boseman's passing later. Now, one of the immediate things that worried me about this sequel was Namor. In the comics, it's pronounced Namor, but in this film, it's Namor. There's sort of an Aztecian sort of aesthetic and nationality that goes into his character here. Now, after the amazing cultural relevance and powerful story highlighted by obviously Killmonger, stories centered here around MCU Aquaman didn't really have me too excited. For all my trepidations, I think they pulled it off here in Namor as believably as they could have. I still think the whole feather ankle thing is a little silly. It doesn't quite look as silly as it does in the comics. But in terms of the updated look for Namor, it looks really good. They gave him a Mayan aesthetic. There's a really good performance from the actor Taneka Huerta. They made this character in Civilization for the most part work pretty well. In terms of the effects on the underwater stuff and all that kind of stuff, and even some of the action scenes here and there, worked pretty well. And their initial scenes when you see the submarines, they're not called that in this film, they're called that in the comics. All that stuff worked out pretty well. I don't have too big complaints about that, despite some stuff here and there. Prior to even seeing, though, how they would handle any of this Namor stuff, one of the main reasons to have confidence in this film was writer-director Ryan Coogler, the head man of the first Black Panther. Now, this guy is just an unbelievable filmmaker. Through all the films that he's directed, and even a few that he's produced here and there, he knows how to find the heart of a story. And what I mean is, where does the emotion and true feeling from the story, where's that going to come from? In the first film, you had a lot of good emotional elements going for it, but I believe the centerpiece of that was seeing Killmonger's story. I mean, what a great emotional story. Just a villain that you sort of understood where he was coming from, and just the rage and all that kind of stuff. It made for just a really deep film when you looked at it in the grand scheme of things. In this case, the heart of the story comes in seeing how mainly our leaders of Wakanda pick up the pieces and deal with the loss of their king. And that puts the focus on two characters here in particular, and that's Queen Ramonda and Shuri. Now, while obvious, it's eye-popping to see how expanded their roles are of these two characters in this film compared to the first film. They, mainly Shuri, had solid roles in the first film, but nothing compared to what we see going on in this film. Queen Ramonda was definitely the lesser of these two roles in the first film. It almost felt like a waste of Angela Bassett, just because that character really didn't have much to do. That all changes in this film, where she is front and center, takes command as leader of Wakanda, and Bassett definitely brings her A game here, and she has some magnificent scenes in terms of her performance in this film. Then there's Shuri, whose character development is truly something special to see in this film. There were questions initially, I remember when this film was sort of being conceived after Boseman's passing, whether or not this film would truly embrace Shuri as the true lead character here, or if it would feel like more of an ensemble piece. Well, while everyone else definitely has their appropriate time to shine here, Shuri is definitely the top dog here, or Panther, and seeing how that character comes into her own and embraces the challenges that come before her, the plethora of challenges, it gave me chills watching it and chills just thinking about it. It's amazing to see this character grow up, because we saw her initially in the first film as that happy-go-lucky tech teenager girl. I mean, we see it at a whole lot of humor in the first film, but now here she reaches a whole different kind of stage in her life in this film. And just like Angela Bassett, Letitia Wright is amazing in this film and brings her A game as well. The other supporting characters that return here that were in the first film, you have Okoye, Nakia, and M'Baku. They were all incorporated well and had plenty of time to shine and be fleshed out as characters. And I just love M'Baku. I could definitely go for a spinoff with that guy. He's just so goddamn funny and entertaining in every scene he's in. But definitely has some profound scenes later on in the film. I already talked about Namor, and like I said, I think for the most part the character was solid here, despite me not thinking it was the best idea to have the whole sort of Aquaman kind of water sort of villain or whatever you want to call him. But here I think it was pretty okay. They did about as good a job as I think you could, while being respectful to the source material. Besides Namor, the other new character introduced here, main new character anyway, is a character named Riri Williams, known as Ironheart in the comics. Obviously, the character was introduced here as part of the greater plans they have in the future. But I think they incorporated her well. I like the character. She was solid. It was fun seeing the sort of like a version of the Iron Man armor in action again. She has a nice friendship that develops with Shuri. Honestly, it was fine here. In all honesty, not a whole ton of time is spent really going into her backstory and whatnot. But to be honest, a 19-year-old black chick who develops a Stark Tech is hardly the craziest thing the MCU has done here, so we didn't need too much time going into her backstory. That's not really the focus here. It'll definitely be interesting to see what they do with that character going forward. The two words I would use to describe this film, though, are epic and emotional. The epic part is obviously self-explanatory, but once the, true conflict begins with the Wakandans and the Sumerians, like I said, they don't exactly call them that in this film, that's when the epicness really kicks in, and so you get your very sort of war-heavy narrative and action and spectacle that we've seen in the TV spots that takes place in the second half of the film. Thankfully, the effects here are much better than the ones we saw in the first Black Panther, the only real problem with that first movie, and the action packs a pretty nice punch also. It's always obviously more meaningful when a movie combines the epic spectacle with true stakes and emotion, and this movie did about as good a job as any. There's only one aspect towards sort of something that happened towards the end, a sort of emotional and nuanced approach. There was a plot point that didn't quite work for me all the way when I think about it, but I guess in the grand scheme of things, that's a personal preference of mine. It isn't really a problem with the movie overall. It all harkens back to the fact that this movie's heart was obviously in the right place, and it's honestly tough to think of a better possible combination of heart, spectacle, memoriam, and even some MCU setup for the future, because this movie has plenty of surprises of its own in this 2.5-hour movie. It's 2 hours and 40 minutes if you include the final, if you sit through all the credits. It's definitely a long runtime. However, I guess I was enjoying myself so much, you didn't really think about it. As long as you're in the theater watching something you really enjoy, that time can sort of just fly by. And I was more than happy to be in the theater watching to see what this movie had in store for me. This movie would overall end up getting a 9 out of 10 for Wakanda Forever. The obvious question would be, how does this compare to the first film? Well, for reference, I'd probably give the first Black Panther a 9.5 out of 10. For me, I didn't need nor do I really care if this movie is as good as the first Black Panther. Actually, for some people, it probably will. I guess if I just look back at the first Black Panther, so there's just some more, I guess, culturally relevant stuff. The story with Killmonger, just, seeing this world for the first time. I guess that's why I would give that the edge. But this movie obviously has aspects that the first film, just couldn't replicate. So there is that. Overall, like I said, this movie was about as epic and emotional as it needed to be, just as it should have been. When you see how this movie turned out, it's honestly hard to imagine my initial idea for this film, which was simply recasting Mr. Boseman in a respectful way, and then going forward with the movie after that. But when you see how the story that they came up with here, it's kind of hard to imagine, what else they could have done that would have been a better option. But you know what? That's why Kevin Feige and Ryan Coogler get paid the big bucks at Marvel, and I'm just here reviewing the film, but I think we're all better for it. So that'll do it for my review of Black Panther Wakanda Forever. If you made it to the end, thank you for watching.